This quirky ad provided the name for one of the most mysterious and legendary gangs of the past. The undisputed faces of Manchester's criminal underworld, a presence felt in every backroom deal, every nightclub, every high-stakes poker game in town, and yet they were considered as a myth by many because of their shrewd strategies to evade the law. From commanding fear to respect, they are known to have thrown out the infamous Kray Twins once. This is the story of the Quality Street gang, of which Jimmy the Weed Donnelly not only rose to fame, but cleared the air about the gang's mystery. Before we jump into the happening story of Donnelly, let's take a look at this mysterious gang first. The reputation of the Quality Street gang spread far beyond the city limits. Even those who had never met them knew better than to cross them. To some, they were old-school gangsters with strict codes. To others, they were ruthless criminals who controlled Manchester's crime scene with an iron grip. They had money, power and connections that reached deep into the city's police force. Their story is a blend of fact and fiction, with myths that refuse to die. Some say they ran Manchester. Others insist that they never existed as a true criminal organisation. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. According to Stan Bowles, the soccer star who grew up with them, in some ways they were greater celebrities than the rock stars and footballers they knew and partied with. The gang even inspired a rock band song, the details of which we will tell you later. Leveraging 1960s Manchester's thriving clubland, the gang became part and parcel of the nightclubs, casinos and street corners. However, they remained less popular with the police. For years, senior officers tried to lay numerous crimes at their door, but failed. That led many officers to believe the gang was a myth. It was just a strategy by the criminals, seeking to boost their reputations. Nevertheless, this myth was broken by a man none other than a gang member himself, Jimmy Donnelly. One of the core members of the Quality Street gang, Jimmy wrote an autobiography called Jimmy the Weed to set the record straight and tell the world his gang's story. Jimmy was born in 1940, 4 weeks before the infamous bombing raids conducted by Nazi Germany to flatten down Manchester. As the city centre was caught in flames, Jimmy was safely asleep in the new Wythenshawe estate. This was the place that his Irish bricklayer father had helped build and his parents' residence. One of 7 children, Jimmy was entranced by the busy market and opportunity to make money. He worked as a bike boy after leaving school at 15. Soon, he realised that there was a way to add to his £2 a week wages. He started nicking turkey or steaks when nobody was looking. If I was delivering a box of place, I'd stick my hand in and pinch 2 or 3 pieces, put them in my bag, and at the end of the day I might have £2 of fish. Every day I'd nick loads of fish, and there was a fella in Hume who'd be selling it in his chippy. But he also explained that time wasn't treating them well. Don't forget, we were hungry in them days. We were starving. Donnelly wasn't your typical tall or burly gangster, but his height didn't stop him from being a rebel and a hard nut. In his own words, "I never liked authority, and I was an utter street fighter. I boxed at school and would take on anyone, all the bullies. None of them ever scared me." More than a fighter, Jimmy was an entrepreneur at heart. He used to buy dinner tickets and fireworks, collected coal from railway lines to flog around the neighbourhood, but none of these occupations explained how he was part of Gangland. His association with the underworld came from the fact that he was a suave thief. He broke into local shops and warehouses to steal anything he could find. I don't know why I turned out like that, as my mother was very religious. I think I just liked the thrill of it, the feeling that I was getting away with something. Nevertheless, Donnelly's inclinations led him to the Quality Street gang, eventually, which was formed in the Smithfield Market, a place where Jimmy worked. Smithfield Market was an interesting place at the time. Sitting beside Ancoats, the old industrial hub that churned out poor, tough, independent men, many of whom made up the vast market's pool of casual labour. These lads had little education, but were determined to make their way in the world. That's how these single-minded, tough and a little too ambitious people formed the gang. According to Donnelly, most of us had known each other for years. Some were straight businessmen, some were rogues, some were a mixture of the two, leaning more in one direction or the other, depending on circumstance and opportunity. We could all look after ourselves, and some were very hard men indeed. In his own words, "At heart, we were a bunch of mates, mainly from the Ancoats area, who both enjoyed each other's company socially and had dealings together in business. Really, that was all there was to it. At this place, Donnelly became friends with Jimmy Monaghan, who later became known as Jim Swords. Monaghan was a vicious fistfighter who frequently flattened grown men at the mere age of 16. His trajectory was evident, as he became a pro boxer and his ring name was Jim Swords. With others, the duo formed the Market Mob, the forerunner to the Quality Street Gang. Together, they were very brutal. They fought with people without any care or worry. If there were more opponents than them, they would bring out the axe, a machete or a knife. A few doormen at the clubs got cheeky and the gang would give them a few beltings. When asked if he ever feared that he would be eliminated from such fights, Jimmy said, "No, I never had any fear, but I was badly hurt, like a lot of people. I saw a lot of injuries, but you just get yourself stitched up. I must have 200 stitches in my body." Donnelly's nickname came from the market where an old worker told colleagues, "He grows on you, this Jimmy, like a weed." Donnelly and Swords had a brush with the law after an infamous fight at the door of the Wilton Club, when a rival lost part of his nose. This fight sent the duo to serving time on remand in Strangeways. After getting released, Swords concentrated on his boxing career, fighting 5 British champions, while Donnelly built up a construction business in his late 20s. But their paths were not as different as they may sound to you. Both mixed with wider circles that later became known as the Quality Street Gang. Now, let's come to this infamous incident that involves the Kray Twins. On their visit to Manchester, the Gangster twins were accompanying boxing great Joe Louis on a meet and greet tour. They booked into the Midland Hotel with their henchmen. They went out. It was rare for the Kray Twins to go out and not have a scuffle with someone. And this was not one of those rare occasions. As the gangster group went out on the town, one doorman ended up getting punched by Reggie. According to Donnelly, they were at the Cabaret Club when some club owners made phone calls to pass on the message that a heavy-duty Cockney firm was in town, so that they should stay alert in case there was trouble. He had briefly met the Crays in North London in the early 60s and had no beef with them, but they assured the club owners they would handle them if needed. There was no other trouble than this one incident. After a police warning, the Crays departed the next day, but the grapevine buzzed with a different version, which included the Kray Twins being run off the town and escorted to the train station by a team of locals. Donnelly admitted that they were dangerous men, but, man to man, they could never in a million years have beaten Jim Swords. Coming back to Donnelly, other than his business activities, he liked to gamble. Well, liking would be an understatement here. He was a chronic gambler who eventually declared bankruptcy. After offloading his building firm, the Weed started a series of ventures from behind the scenes, including a scrapyard, market stalls and a car lot. He also opened the city's ritziest massage parlour, named El Corrida. At night, he and his pals were regular at clubs such as Dino's and the notorious Showbiz bar run by Phyllis, the mother of Thin Lizzy frontman Phil Lynott. The parties went on all night. I saw George Best leave there at 8 o'clock in the morning to catch a plane to London to play for United that afternoon. Donnelly got a mention in Lynott's song, Johnny the Fox Meets Jimmy the Weed. The Weed later owned various clubs and pubs, including the famous Brown Bull Hotel by Deansgate train station. He was a fight promoter, bookmaker, scrap merchant, car dealer, market trader and impresario. But above all, he was a career criminal, a fact that he admits himself. The Weed dealt in stolen gems, touted sports tickets and ran massage parlours. His friends were all bank robbers, including the prolific Crazy Face Gang. The gang got its name because its members wore fright masks. The gang was so notorious it caused Chief Constable James Anderton to put armed police patrols on city streets for the first time ever on the UK mainland. Donnelly and his henchmen visited Vegas and Miami to watch boxing and bought villas and yachts in Spain. Due to their luxurious pursuits, they caught the attention of the authorities. Donnelly says, "They saw us pouncing about the town in our rollers and Bentleys, owning clubs, sitting around in our cars, pitching in the sun, drinking tea and gossiping, and it was an affront to them. They hated it. But giving in to the authorities wasn't acceptable for Donnelly. Once, he saw a van parked outside of his scrapyard. He went over there with a crony carrying a can of petrol and saying loudly, "Let's set it alight." Frantic undercover cops jumped out, bursting the door open and blowing their cover all along the way. In another instance, the police watched them from the roof of the Ancoats Hospital, but they got tipped off by a kitchen worker. Another time, the coppers spied on them from the CIS building, and this time, the window cleaners told them. With their surveillance attempts failing, the coppers became suspicious that their force had been infiltrated, but it was far more inefficiency than a conspiracy. Nevertheless, Jimmy was finally arrested for fraud in the sale of stolen airline tickets. The authorities would have taken a sigh of relief, but he walked free again after getting his charge reduced. In his own words, "I've been through 11 court trials and have walked away from all of them. Even when I've been convicted, with time already served on remand, I've never had to go back to prison." The public outside Manchester still didn't know much about the Quality Street Gang. The situation would have remained like that if the biggest police scandal of the 1980s didn't happen. The scandal was the Stalker affair and involved allegations that Deputy Chief Constable John Stalker, an officer of impeccable credentials, had an improper friendship with a businessman called Kevin Taylor, a friend of the Quality Street Gang from when he sold second-hand vehicles in Ancoats. Donnelly tells that Kevin moved into property investment heavily in the 70s. He used to run out of cash and sought help from the gang. After many years, Kevin became rich and owned a big mansion and a yacht. He was also involved in politics. As for Stalker, he had an impeccable record and was investigating the shoot-to-kill policy of the police. It didn't sit well with the officers, since it could land them in trouble. In May 1984, the officer in charge of the internal complaints at GMP was told that Stalker was linked to some of the people who were involved in organised crime in Manchester. The allegation reportedly came from David Burton, an unreliable police informant connected remotely with the Quality Street Gang. The gang knew Taylor, who knew Stalker, but that was the extent of it. Burton put 2 and 2 together, only to make 5 from it. The allegation was baseless, but it ruined Stalker's career. These claims, reinforced by the long-standing suspicion that the gang had a mole within the Greater Manchester Police, led ultimately to Stalker's suspension and his removal from an extremely sensitive inquiry he was conducting. Colin Sampson, Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, later investigated the claims of Stalker's association with Kevin Taylor and known criminals between 1971 and 1985. The weed was at the centre of the storm. There was a photograph of him with Stalker's wife at a 50th birthday party at Kevin Taylor's mansion near Bury. The police interviewed him multiple times, but this time Donnelly had nothing to hide. Stalker returned to work later, but retired after realising he couldn't work within GMP anymore. He wrote a scathing memoir. As for Kevin Taylor, he sued the GMP for wrongful prosecution and agreed to an out-of-court settlement of more than £1 million from GMP. Coming back to Jimmy, relocating to Blackpool in the early 1990s to escape the attention of Manchester police, he was arrested for suspected narcotic trafficking and then released. Again, he got involved in a scam by buying cloned Sky TV cards from Germany. In his later years, he retired from his activities and spent his time between a small flat in Ancoats and Thailand. His grandchildren have been privately educated, and his one hope for them is that they don't follow his lifestyle. His own sons have done well in life, while his nephews founded their highly successful Geogoi clothing company. Suffering from cancer that infiltrated his kidneys, Jimmy knew he wouldn't survive this. In 2019, he opened up about his life and told the world about the gang. While giving an interview to the Manchester Evening News, he said, "I don't suppose I can get in much trouble these days. The legs have gone, but the heart is still there." Now that we've looked into Donnelly's life in detail, let's move to the Quality Street Gang. The gang itself was more of businessmen who conducted illicit activities, but with an entrepreneurial flourish. It didn't take long for them to outgrow the market. Money was there to be made elsewhere, in industries where the real power was. They expanded into construction, using strong-arm tactics to control contracts and labour. They moved into Manchester's thriving club scene, where the biggest names in football, music and entertainment rubbed shoulders with the Underworld elite. It was here that their name was born. One night, as a group of them arrived at the Cabaret Club on Oxford Street, the doorman recognised them instantly. He had seen them before, always dressed to kill, always in the best suits, always carrying themselves with an air of authority. They looked like the stylish gangsters from a popular chocolate advert at the time. where men in fedoras and tailored suits carried out a smooth, almost comical heist. With a smirk he muttered, "Here they are, the Quality Street Mob." The name stuck. And why wouldn't it? It fitted them perfectly. They were flash, sharp, untouchable. They drove Bentleys and Rolls Royces, wore silk shirts and handmade shoes, drank the finest champagne in clubs where they were always given the best tables. They didn't hide in the shadows like common crooks. They were part of the city's social elite, blending crime with class. Their influence in Manchester's clubland was absolute. From Dino's to the Brown Bull, from the Cabaret Club to the notorious Showbiz Bar, they had a hand in every major establishment that mattered. They weren't just customers. They controlled who got in, who got out, and who got to do business. Club owners knew better than to say no when one of them asked for a favour. Bouncers gave them a wide berth. If a fight broke out, it wasn't settled with security, it was settled their way. They weren't just feared, they were admired. They partied with footballers, drinking with legends like George Best, who was no stranger to a night out that lasted until the morning. They rubbed shoulders with musicians, including Phil Lynott, the frontman of Thin Lizzy, who spent time at the Showbiz Bar run by his own mother. He saw them, watched how they moved, how they owned every room they walked into. And, in 1976, when Thin Lizzy released The Boys Are Back in Town, it was widely believed to be in illegal gambling, running high-stakes games in private rooms where fortunes changed hands overnight. If a debt wasn't paid, there were consequences. Some say they were involved in fraud at a scale that rivaled London's biggest crime syndicates, dealing in counterfeit goods, fake identities, and insurance scams that made small-time crooks look like amateurs. They handled stolen goods like they were running a department store, knowing exactly where to move anything from luxury watches to entire truckloads of contraband. Some of Manchester's most successful businesses had origins that were far from legal, and the Quality Street Gang were often the invisible hand pulling the strings. According to Donnelly, if there was ever any trouble, we were all in it together. On the gang's crimes, he said, some of them were armed robbers, safe blowers, some were con men, and some were doing fraud. We were all into crime in a different way. Despite their different pursuits, they united against a common threat. If somebody threatened us, we'd be there, the whole lot of us. Men such as Jim Swords and his brother Joe, Jimmy's brother-in-law Joe Leach, Vinny and Louis Chiavo, Mick Brown, Dennis Croller, and boxing promoter Jack Trickett. They liked to dress smart and hang out in the finest establishments. The other thing they were crazy about was cars. I was into Yanks. I always had American cars. Jimmy was the same. Some had Rollies. We were flash because of what we had, says Donnelly. The gang didn't hang out in pubs. They didn't want to be disturbed by people kicking off at each other every minute. They preferred going to the Grand Hotel in the cocktail bar or upmarket bars. Eventually, things started changing in the gangland as well. The streets of Manchester were changing in ways the old guard wasn't prepared for. By the 1990s, the face of crime in the city had shifted dramatically. The new generation of criminals didn't care about appearances, didn't bother with the social connections or the influence of the Quality Street Gang had spent years cultivating. They had no interest in gentlemanly conduct or maintaining a code of honour. As a new wave of gangsters was younger, more volatile and infinitely more violent. The booming narcotics trade brought a level of brutality that hadn't been seen before. Guns replaced fists, executions replaced warnings. Street-level disputes over money, territory and respect ended in blood rather than negotiations. For years, the Quality Street Gang had operated under a unique set of rules. They didn't need to enforce their influence through excessive violence. Their presence alone was often enough to control a room, a club, or even an entire district. They made money through gambling, clubs, property and fraud, always keeping one step ahead of the law. Now, none of that mattered. Territorial disputes turned Manchester's criminal landscape into a battlefield. Groups like the Cheetham Hill Gang and Moss Side's Doddington and Gooch crews brought an entirely new level of organised crime to the city. Drive-by shootings became more common. Turf wars between rival factions erupted in broad daylight. The meticulous, structured operations of the Quality Street Gang were no match for the ruthless, shoot-first mentality of the new generation. One by one, the old faces of the Quality Street Gang disappeared. Some moved to Spain, Marbella, or the south of France, retreating to quiet lives funded by decades of wealth. Others transitioned into legitimate businesses, property development, private security firms, even high-end restaurants. A few, like Donnelly, remained in Manchester but kept a much lower profile, watching from a distance as the city they once ruled descended into chaos. Those who refused to adapt didn't last long. The gangsters who had relied on their reputation rather than firepower found themselves at a disadvantage. Some were swallowed up by the new underworld, unable to compete with the younger, more ruthless criminals. Others simply faded into obscurity, forgotten as Manchester moved on. Yet, despite their decline, the legend of the Quality Street Gang never truly died. Years later, people still debated who they really were. Were they a highly sophisticated crime syndicate controlling Manchester from the shadows? Or were they just a social group of wealthy, connected men who enjoyed the benefits of their status without ever truly engaging in organised crime? Even within law enforcement, opinions remained divided. Some officers swore they had evidence that the gang had been involved in everything from armed robbery to gun running for the IRA. Others admitted that, despite years of investigations, they had never been able to pin anything serious on the group. That ambiguity only fueled their mythology. Decades after their decline, the Quality Street Gang re-entered public discourse in a way no one expected, through a hotel controversy. In 2019, a Liverpool-based developer proposed a plan to transform a historic Manchester pub into a high-end boutique hotel. The proposed name? The Quality Street Hotel. The reaction was immediate. Some saw it as a tribute to Manchester's rich history. Others were outraged, arguing that it glorified the city's criminal past. Local politicians and community leaders called it tacky crime worship tourism, arguing that Manchester should celebrate its achievements, not its underworld figures. But for those who remembered the gang in their prime, the controversy was almost amusing. The name had started as a joke, a reference to a chocolate advert from the 1960s, yet, over the decades, it had grown to something much bigger. The Quality Street Gang had been called many things: businessmen, gangsters, fraudsters, nightclub owners, legends. Now they are part of Manchester's folklore. Their story has outlived their influence, cementing their place in history as one of the city's most notorious and enigmatic groups. For those who once feared them, they are a reminder of a different era, a time when power came from reputation rather than firepower, when influence was wielded in exclusive clubs rather than on social media. For those who admired them, they are the last of a dying breed, the old-school gangsters who commanded respect without needing to pull a trigger. Either way, one thing is certain: the Quality Street Gang may have disappeared from the streets of Manchester, but their legend would never die.